Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. During COP26, Nigeria committed to achieve net zero by 2060. And barely a week after the conference, President Muhammadu Buhari signed into law the Climate Change Act 2021, which was passed by the National Assembly in October of that year. The act seeks to provide a framework for achieving low greenhouse gas emissions and to mainstream climate change actions into national plans and programs. Apart from establishing the National Council on Climate Change, we shall have the power to make policies and decisions on all matters relating to climate change in the country. The Act also provides that the Council will collaborate with the Federal Inland Revenue Service to develop a mechanism for carbon tax in the country. The proceeds from the carbon tax, as well as emissions trading, among other sources of funds, will be used for the Climate Change Fund proposed by the Act. Today on Earthfile, we'll look at the impact this Act will have and what you should know about it. Just stay with us. Climate change is perhaps the biggest challenge facing humanity at this time. According to the Global Risks Report 2023, climate and nature-related risks lead the top 10 risks by severity that are expected to manifest over the next decade. Failure to mitigate climate change, failure of climate change adaptation, natural disasters and extreme weather events top the rankings as the most severe risks on a global scale. Conflict and geo-economic tensions have given rise to a series of deeply interconnected global risks, and energy and food shortages will continue to plague the world in the next 2 years, with the cost of living and debt servicing to rise sharply, says the Global Risk Report 2023. Meanwhile, these short-term risks will undermine the actions of the international community to address long-term challenges such as climate change and biodiversity conservation.
We are flirting with climate disaster. Every week brings a new climate horror story. Greenhouse gas emissions are at record levels and growing. The commitment to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is nearly going up in smoke. Without further action, we are headed to a 2.8 degree increase. The truth is that more and more businesses are making net zero commitments, but benchmarks and criteria are often dubious or murky. And this can mislead consumers, investors and regulators with false narratives. And it feeds a culture of climate misinformation and confusion, and leaves the door open to greenwashing. That's why we created an expert group on net zero emissions commitments. Recently, the group has issued a how-to guide for credible, accountable net zero pledges. Now, the transition to net zero must be grounded in real emissions cuts and not relying essentially on carbon credits or shadow markets.
The Global Risk Report 2023 further warns that if the international community fails to cooperate more effectively in climate change mitigation and adaptation, the risks it mentioned will lead to continued global warming and ecosystem collapse in the next decade. In 2022, Nigeria was not spared, as the country recorded more than 600 deaths from the worst floods within the decade. More than 30 states in the country were affected by the floods following heavy rainfall across communities. The devastation affected up to 2.5 million people. It led to the destruction of over 300,000 hectares of farmland and destroyed transport infrastructure worth about 80 billion naira. To curb the devastating impact of climate change is at the heart of the Paris Agreement, which government agreed to in 2015, and it aims to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, which cause climate change. It also aims to protect communities and natural habitats, mobilize finance, and to work together to deliver all the goals. Nigeria first developed a climate change policy known as the Nigeria Climate Change Policy Response and Strategy in 2012, to promote low carbon emissions and to respond effectively to the impact of climate change, such as extreme weather events, food insecurity, and many more. In 2021, the Federal Ministry of Environment, through the Department of Climate Change, introduced the National Climate Change Policy for the 2021 to 2030 period. The National Climate Change Policy sets out Nigeria's climate change policy direction. It addresses conditions required to attain Nigeria's vision to be a climate-resilient economy and sectoral measures for mitigating the effect of climate change in the country.
There are many policies, there are many programs. But remember, majority of those programs are not backed by law. And if you don't have legal framework backing your policies or your programs, then you know that their implementation is almost going to be just superficial. Because with a law in place, it means that you can plan well. Whoever is going to engage with you as the council knows what he can get and what he expects from you. And then you can do the enforcement part. Because without enforcement, then regulations cannot be successful. Two, it also made, the arrangement or the existence of the council as a level higher than the ministries, and also at a level that is central to all the ministries, because it is domiciled in the presidency. And that anything that has issue of regulations or orders or guidelines that need to be enforced, or even the policies, once you have the presidential go-ahead for their implementation, or you have the approval of the president and then the council endorses it, then you know that is as good as having the necessary catalyst to implement those activities. So for these reasons, I think the council is one of the best things that has happened to Nigeria in the climate change discourse.
The Act provides that the newly established National Climate Change Commission, in conjunction with the ministries in charge of environment, budget and national planning, will be responsible for formulating Nigeria's National Climate Change Action Plan going forward.
The council, by virtue of its name, it's an umbrella administrative institution that is placed above the level of departments and ministries, because it is domiciled in the presidency, it is headed by the president as the chairman, and the vice president is the vice chair, with a total of nothing less than 13 ministers of key ministries that are involved in climate change. We have the representative of youth, we have representative of women, we also have representatives of people living with disabilities. All these are full members. The CBN governor is also a member. The GMD of NNPC is also a member. So you can't compare this with the department. And everything about climate change policies and decisions for Nigeria and on behalf of Nigeria is to be led, enforced, and oversighted by this National Council.
The action plan will include details about Nigeria's carbon budget, defined in the Act to mean the approved quantity of greenhouse gas emissions that is acceptable over a specified time. It also includes details of greenhouse gas emissions profile for sectors of the economy, incentives for private and public entities that achieve their greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and the level of Nigeria's compliance with its international climate change commitments. The Act also provides that the action plan would cover a 5-year period, with the first plan expected to be produced no later than 12 months from the commencement of the Climate Change Act.
There is on one side the budgetary provisions that comes with every annual budget. And there are also opportunities for other revenue inflows for the purpose of the activities and programs of the council. The act, that is the law itself, has given powers or mandated the council to establish what is known as a National Climate Change Fund for Nigeria. This fund is going to be devoted to nothing other than running the council, as well as undertaking programs, projects, initiatives, and also in consultation with states or in collaboration with states and local government to implement this same. And then this climate change fund is going to be described as the fund itself, will have contributions from the budget as well as other revenue sources the law has mandated to council to put in place. One, to make a plan, a framework for implementation so that we have a carbon tax system in Nigeria. We are also going to do a carbon budget that gives allowances of emissions to entities. And that when you flout these allowances, you will be charged some levies. These levies will also go into the climate change fund. We also have contributions from international organizations because the council can receive monetary inflows from the international as well as from bilateral sources. So these will combine to provide a sustainable, readily available line of funding for the council for its activities.
Nigeria's energy transition plan was unveiled shortly after President Muhammadu Buhari announced Nigeria's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060 at 2021 United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, highlighting the scale of effort required to achieve the 2060 net zero target, while also meeting the nation's energy needs. The Nigeria Energy Transition Plan is a data-backed, multi-pronged strategy developed for the achievement of net zero emissions in terms of the nation's energy consumption.
We're looking at where we can pull in other sources of funding that are local, that are domestic, at the same time crowding, the funding that can come from the donors and development agencies that can play that role in sharing risk, where the perception of risk, where it's a challenge. And if we take, for example, the Integrated Energy Planning Tool, which sets out, the funding gap required to achieve net zero, universal energy access by 2030. It estimates that we require, if we take just the off-grid energy sector alone, it's about $16.4 billion that is required. And that will electrify about 620,000 communities. 105,000 of that is for mini grids, and there are about 502,000 or thereabout is from standalone solar systems. Now, this is renewable energy that can attract, cheaper sources of funding coming from the donors and development partners, because it's addressing the unserved, the underserved markets. And I think being able to leverage, that sort of the platform that has been put in place, the clarity that has been put in terms of funding, and the incentives that have also been provided to pool capital, both local and international, to address this gap. I think it's one way in beginning to address the problem. We can't solve all of the issues as an institution. Of course, we work and partner with government, but there are areas where they've created, a platform for private capital to come in and play. And I think there is some good progress in that. Like I did mention, the role of the Rural Education Agency in doing this is quite tremendous. The team has been quite private sector friendly, and that has demonstrated that where you have agencies like this, capital will come. And once local capital comes, international capital comes as well.
The transition plan sets out a timeline and framework for the attainment of emissions reduction across 5 key sectors, which are power, cooking, oil and gas, transport and industry. Within the scope of the energy transition plan, about 65% of Nigeria's emissions are affected. $1.9 trillion is required to get to the net zero by 2060, including $410 billion above projected usual spending. This additional cost translates to about $10 billion annually. Just before COP27, Nigeria started the fundraising campaign to meet the target. A new report from the UN Climate Change shows countries are bending the curve of global greenhouse gas emissions downward, but underlines that these efforts remain insufficient to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. According to the report, the combined climate pledges of 193 parties under the Paris Agreement could put the world on track for around 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. This latest report also shows current commitments will increase emissions by 10.6% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. This is an improvement over last year's assessment, which found countries were on path to increase emissions by 13.7% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. Nigeria shows the dilemma that a country with limited contribution to climate change in the past also has to abstain from developing and exploiting fossil fuel resources if the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is to be kept. The country's energy sector plans are at odds with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. The country has one of the least reliable electricity grids, and Nigerians spend billions per year on generators. As with most African countries, the Climate Action Tracker's fair share rating means Nigeria will need considerable international support to decarbonize its economy.
Climate change action involves winners and losers, and this is not often well understood by commentators. For every action, there may be people who will lose and people who will benefit. The transition, for example, away from fossil fuel to green energy could result in some people that have had power in the fossil fuel industry losing power and new emergent incumbents having power. Some nations are still struggling to understand the way in which they can act on climate change and still keep a competitive edge. And this is the challenge that we face in making more rapid progress. And so what we need to do is continue to argue to show how we can combine climate action and the pursuit of, the good life, development, economic growth, but also to argue that, growth is not everything, profit is not everything. And sometimes we need to put, Mother Earth, humanity, morality, justice, equity first. And it is working, but it's not working as fast. So we need to continue to press the argument and double down the diplomacy and hope that we can get more traction and more progress.
In August 2022, to boost its net zero target, Nigeria launched the Emissions Trading Scheme, and in November joined 6 other African countries to inaugurate the new African Carbon Markets Initiative at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Egypt, with the objective to scale the production of carbon credits across the continent. The African Carbon Markets Initiative is expected to unlock $6 billion in income and support 30 million jobs.
Issue of socio-economic benefit or environmental benefit alone is also an economic benefit now to those who will join the trail on time. Because the unfortunate part of it is when the market commences, you can't jump on the train if you don't have it established. And you must know your environment to know what climate are you operating in, and so what species can you venture into, and this also will tell to know when you'll be mature for the market. If your ecological climate can only do species that will come into full maturity in 20, 30 years, then you cannot join the market until the maturity is there. So the earlier you join, the better. Even when the market is still being packaged, you have something already working towards the market, and that can be accounted for or counted as part of it, and you can start even earning incentive before you are ready for the market. But if you don't have it on ground, nobody's going to invest into yellow resources that has not really pointed towards any direction. Red Plus is dealing with already established carbon sequestration or a forest cover. But this is working towards it. Why is still guaranteeing? That's why we are trying to preach and encourage people to embrace agroforestry. Because people tend to quick to ask and said, if we plant with our entire land, what do we eat? But if you embrace agroforestry, that means you can still do your agricultural activities within the established plantation that will eventually count for you as carbon credit. By the time you start earning the carbon credit, then you want to do less agriculture because the economic yield of the carbon credit will outweigh the agricultural return. But not to say you still have to feed, but now you have to embrace intensive farming as against the extensive farming that is just a sheer waste of land.
How will the community, local communities benefit from this?
That's why we're educating, and we're not really saying it's no longer a public investment. It's community and people's investment. Now we're telling people and educating them, this is the way to go. And nobody is imposing any plant, crop, or species on you. What are the endemic species to your environment that you have learned to do economics with all of your life? So can we help you with new species or teach you a better practice to give a faster growth or a faster yield or a larger yield, so that at the end of the day you will come to realize that nobody is taking anything away from you. The only thing we are interested in is a better environment that will guarantee healthy environment for healthy people and cohabiting with nature harmoniously without anybody injurious to each other.
By 2050, the market is targeting over 1.5 billion credits annually in Africa, leveraging over $120 billion and supporting over 110 million jobs.
As NGOs, we tell the government where it is wrong, but also we need to protect our government as well, because we will not just expose our government. When the government is doing something right, we say, yes, we are doing something right, we stand by it. But when the government is policies are not in favor to the environment, we have to shout. We have to say as it is. And that is why we are ensuring that it's not just about the carbon market. Yes, it's very good, it's very important at the face value. But we must look at the letters and the real spirit of the carbon market to ensure that we are not, it's not a zero-sum affair. Because at the end of the day, you are offsetting here, but you continue to pollute, and then nobody benefits from it, especially the developing world. While the developed world will continue to advance, and then we are not able to catch up with them technologically.
Many experts believe that while the adoption of a hybrid approach to reducing carbon emissions through carbon taxes and emission trading is laudable, they believe the Federal Internal Revenue Service and the National Council on Climate Change need to carefully consult and engage key stakeholders and specialized institutions to fully understand and appreciate the specific design features of both measures. They say failure to consider these and other factors will have a negative impact on the country's climate change ambitions.
Good thing about this council is the fact that it's not just about government, it's about also NGOs, private sector, and so on. And private sector and working together with government, we have seen huge successes. Sometimes there are kind of weaknesses when you have only private sector working together. There are weaknesses when you have only government agencies working together. But by the time you fuse all of them together, then they all synergize, kind of capitalizing on their strengths, and while noticing their weaknesses and overcoming their weaknesses, and they are able to move on. With this approach, we are hoping that we'll be able to see the light of day with this, and we're able to see actions on the ground. Measurable, concrete actions on the ground that will say, yes, we were here, now we have moved the pin to this point, and then we are able to make progress with what the council is out to accomplish.
The experts have warned that the National Council on Climate Change should not only use this as a means to raise additional revenue for the government. Rather, they say it needs to put together a clear framework for the administration of the fund and must report on the judicious use of the fund for socially productive projects to ensure that stakeholders accept and comply with the provision of the Act. Private entities also need to proactively understand the implication of the Act on their activities, as well as their obligations under the Act, because non-compliance will result in penalties determined by the National Council on Climate Change. More importantly, private entities have been advised that they should take advantage of the Act and soon to be introduced incentives to introduce technological innovations that can mitigate the impact of climate change. That's our show for the week. Thank you for watching. We hope you will join us next week. But in the meantime, our inbox, earthfile@channelstv.com, is available for your comments and your questions. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the Earthfile crew here in Lagos, it's bye for now.